The gavel slammed down, echoing through the dusty streets of Oakhaven. 7 sobbing children clung to their mother, a heavy-set, desperate widow the town had mercilessly thrown to the wolves. They were to be split up, sold off, as mere labor. Then, a massive shadow blocked the sun. The mountain man had arrived. The Colorado Territory in the autumn of 1878 was a place completely devoid of mercy. The biting wind that howled down from the jagged peaks of the Rockies stripped the gold from the aspen trees and the hope from the weak. And on this particular Tuesday morning, Oakhaven was a town that had decided to rid itself of a burden. That burden was Josephine Dalton. Josie, as she was known before the town turned its back on her, stood in the center of the muddy town square. She was a woman of substantial girth. Where the harsh frontier starved most women down to raw sinew and bone, Josie was undeniably, unapologetically fat. She had a wide, heavy frame, thick arms that had scrubbed 1,000 floors, and a round, plump face currently flushed crimson with sheer panic. Beneath her faded gingham dress, her broad chest heaved as she struggled to catch her breath, her stout legs trembling under her own considerable weight and the crushing reality of her circumstances. Her husband, Arthur Dalton, had been dead for exactly 3 weeks. He had been swallowed whole by a collapsing shaft in the deep-vein silver mine, leaving Josie with nothing but a mountain of gambling debts she knew nothing about, a barren tract of rocky farmland, and 7 children. 7. They clung to her voluminous skirts like frightened ducklings. Wyatt, the eldest at 14, stood stiffly at her side, his jaw tight, trying to look like the man of the house. Behind him huddled Levi and Clara, twins of 12, followed by 10-year-old Amos, 8-year-old Ruth, 6-year-old Seth, and the baby, little Pearl, who was buried deep against Josie's ample bosom. "Order! I will have order in this square," bellowed Mayor Josiah Higgins. He stood on the wooden boardwalk outside the assayer's office, a ledger in one hand and a gavel in the other. Beside the mayor stood Clement Reed. Reed was the owner of the Oakhaven Bank, a man with a heart as cold as a minted coin. It was Reed who had called in Arthur's debts. It was Reed who had foreclosed on the Dalton cabin. And it was Reed who had invoked the archaic Territorial Vagrancy and Orphanage Act. "Mrs. Dalton," Reed said, his voice dripping with false sympathy, cutting through the murmurs of the gathered townsfolk. "You must understand. We are doing this for the good of the children. You are entirely destitute. You cannot feed yourself, let alone 7 growing mouths." "I can work!" Josie yelled, her voice cracking. She squeezed little Pearl tighter, her thick arms trembling. "I'll take in laundry. I'll bake. I can clean the saloons, Mr. Reed. Just give me a month." A cruel scoff echoed from the crowd. It belonged to Mrs. Harriet Montgomery, the town's wealthiest busybody. "Work? Heavens, Josephine. It takes you 5 minutes just to haul yourself up the church steps. Who is going to pay you to clean? You'd eat half the town's flour supply just trying to sustain yourself. The bank is doing you a favor." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Josie felt the heat of humiliation prickle behind her eyes. She bit her lip, refusing to let the tears fall. She knew she was heavy. She had been plump her whole life, and carrying 7 children had only softened and widened her further. But her size didn't mean she didn't possess a mother's fierce, desperate strength. "They are my flesh and blood," Josie roared, taking a heavy step forward. The crowd actually took a half-step back, intimidated by the sheer, imposing mass of the angry mother. "You ain't taking them from me." "The law has already spoken, Mrs. Dalton," Mayor Higgins said, banging his gavel. "The debt is $300. Unless you have the gold in your apron, the property is forfeit. And since you have no domicile, the children are hereby declared wards of Oakhaven. We will now accept bids for their indentured placement." Josie's knees buckled under her heavy frame. Wyatt caught her arm, struggling under her weight, but managed to keep her upright. The crowd began to murmur with sickening interest. Local farmers needed cheap labor. A 14-year-old boy was as good as a farmhand. A 12-year-old girl could scrub pots. They were going to tear her family apart piece by piece and sell them off to work in the freezing mud. "We will start with the eldest," Reed announced, stepping up to the edge of the boardwalk. Wyatt Dalton. Strong boy, 14 years of age. Good for plowing and mucking. Who will take his indenture for the sum of $50 payable to the bank's debt? "I'll give 40, yelled a grizzled farmer from the back. "No," Josie shrieked, lurching forward. She grabbed Wyatt by his collar, pulling him behind her broad back, shielding him with her own large body. "I'll kill the first man that touches him. I swear to God I'll tear you apart." "Sheriff, restrain the woman," Reed sighed, waving a dismissive, manicured hand. Two deputies stepped forward, looking hesitant. Josie was a massive, cornered bear of a woman, and the wild look in her eyes promised violence. But they were armed, and she was exhausted. It was over. Josie closed her eyes, the tears finally spilling over her plump cheeks, tracing paths through the dust on her face. She prepared to throw her heavy body at the deputies, prepared to die in the dirt of Oakhaven before letting them take her babies. Then the wind seemed to stop. The horses tied to the hitching posts outside the saloon began to whinny and stomp in sudden, panicked agitation. A shadow fell over the boardwalk. "Put the ledger away, Reed." The voice didn't just speak. It rumbled. It was a deep, gravelly sound that seemed to vibrate up from the wooden planks of the town square. The crowd parted instantly, practically shoving each other into the mud to get out of the way. Riding into the square, on a monstrous black draft horse, was Gideon Hayes. Gideon Hayes was Oakhaven's local ghost story made flesh. He lived high up on Bitter Peak, miles away from civilization. He only came down once a year before the first blizzard, trading thick timberwolf pelts and raw, glittering gold dust for coffee, salt, and bullets. He was a colossal man, standing well over 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders as broad as a barn door. A thick, dark beard obscured most of his face, and what skin was visible was rugged, tanned leather, marred by a jagged white scar that tracked from his left temple down to his jawbone, the result, rumor had it, of a hand-to-hand fight with a grizzly. He swung down from his massive horse. His boots hit the mud with a heavy, terrifying thud. He wore a long duster coat made of bear hide, and twin Colt revolvers rested comfortably at his hips. The town square was dead silent. Even the deputies had stopped in their tracks, their hands slowly drifting away from their gun belts. Nobody crossed Gideon Hayes, the last man who had tried, a drunken rustler 3 years ago, had been thrown clean through the front window of the general store. Gideon walked slowly toward the boardwalk, his piercing, icy blue eyes locked onto Clement Reed. "I said, put the ledger away," Gideon repeated, stopping just a few feet from where Josie stood, trembling with her children. "Mr. Hayes," Reed stammered, his confident veneer shattering instantly. "This is town business, legal business. We are settling the Dalton estate." "There's no estate to settle," Gideon said. He reached inside his heavy duster and pulled out a leather pouch. He tossed it through the air. It hit the wooden boardwalk at Reed's feet with a heavy, metallic clink. "There's $300 in raw gold in that bag. The debt is paid." A collective gasp echoed through the crowd. Harriet Montgomery gripped her parasol so tightly her knuckles turned white. Josie stared at the giant of a man in front of her. She wiped her sweaty, tear-stained face with the back of her thick wrist. Why was the phantom of Bitter Peak paying her husband's debts? Arthur didn't know this man. Nobody knew this man. Reed knelt, nervously untying the pouch. He poured a small mound of gleaming, raw gold nuggets into his palm. His greedy eyes widened. This covers the bank's debt, Mr. Hayes, yes, but there is still the matter of the children. The law states that a mother with no visible means of support, no shelter, and no standing— I'm taking her, Gideon interrupted, his voice echoing like thunder against the wooden storefronts. The mayor blinked, utterly bewildered. Taking her? Mr. Hayes, you can't just take people. Are you offering her employment? Gideon slowly turned his massive head to look at Josie. His icy blue eyes swept over her. He didn't look at her with the disgust the townsfolk did. He didn't sneer at her heavy, sweating frame or her worn-out dress that strained at the seams. He just looked at her, his expression entirely unreadable. Then he looked at the 7 terrified children huddled behind her. I'm taking her as my wife, Gideon announced, loud enough for the entire town to hear. I'll take her. And all 7 children. Pandemonium broke out. He's mad, someone hissed. She's a whale. What does a man want with a woman that size? Another voice whispered loudly. He's going to take them up the mountain and eat them, a woman gasped. Josie felt her heart slam against her ribs. She was terrified. This man was a giant, an untamed beast of the wilderness. He wanted to marry her. He wanted her children. Wait, Josie finally choked out. Her voice was raspy, but loud enough to cut through the town's whispers. She took a step toward Gideon. She was a very large woman, but standing next to the mountain man, she felt strangely dwarfed. She tilted her chin up to look him in the eye. I ain't a piece of cattle to be bought, mister. I don't know you. Gideon looked down at her. Up close, Josie could smell pine needles, wood smoke, and old leather on him. You have a choice, ma'am, Gideon said softly, his voice dropping so only she could hear. You can stay here. Watch them sell your boys to the fields and your girls to the laundries. You can sleep in the alley and starve. Or you can pack your kin in my wagon, come up the mountain, and be my wife. You'll be warm, and you'll eat. I don't raise my hand to women, and I don't starve children. Josie looked back at Clement Reed, who was already eyeing Wyatt again, the gold pouch clutched greedily in his fist. She looked at Harriet Montgomery, who was sneering at her. The town had handed her a death sentence. This terrifying stranger from the peaks was offering a lifeline. Josie squared her broad shoulders. She drew herself up to her full, imposing height, letting her heavy frame carry the dignity she had almost lost. You take us all. We don't get split up. You promise me that before God. I swear it, Gideon said firmly. Then I'll marry you, Josie declared. Mayor Higgins performed the ceremony right there in the dirt. It took less than 5 minutes. It was the strangest, ugliest wedding Oakhaven had ever seen. The bride was a sweating, heavy-set widow clutching a baby, and the groom was a scarred, armed giant who didn't even bother to take off his bear-hide coat. Within the hour, Gideon had purchased a second wagon from the livery, loaded it with heavy winter supplies, and motioned for Josie and the children to climb in. Josie's thick legs burned as she hoisted her heavy body up onto the buckboard, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Wyatt took the reins of the trailing wagon, his young face pale with fear, while Gideon led the way on his black draft horse. They didn't look back as they rode out of Oakhaven. The journey up Bitter Peak took 2 grueling days. The air grew thinner and colder, the pine trees towering like silent sentinels. Josie kept the children huddled under heavy wool blankets, her own large body acting as a windbreak for the younger ones. Her mind raced with terrified questions. Why did he do this? A man alone in the wilderness doesn't just buy a heavy widow and 7 extra mouths to feed out of the goodness of his heart. Did he just want slaves for a gold mine? Was he a madman? On the evening of the second day, they reached a massive log cabin built into the side of a granite cliff. It was fortified, sturdy, and entirely isolated. Gideon helped them down. For a giant of a man, his hands were surprisingly steady as he helped Josie, offering a grip that easily supported her heavy weight without making her feel clumsy. "Get inside. There's a fire laid in the hearth. Food in the larder," Gideon said, his voice flat. Josie ushered her freezing children inside. The cabin was huge, warm, and remarkably clean. But as the heavy oak door shut behind them, Josie heard a sound that made her blood run ice cold. Clack. It was the heavy, undeniable sound of an iron deadbolt sliding into place. Josie dropped the blanket she was holding and lunged for the door. She threw her heavy weight against the thick wood, twisting the iron handle. It didn't budge. Gideon Hayes had just locked them inside, from the outside. "Mama?" little Seth whispered, his teeth chattering in the sudden eerie silence of the cabin. "Why did the new pa lock us in?" Josie pressed her forehead against the thick oak wood, her wide chest rising and falling in rapid, terrified breaths as the sun set over the jagged, lonely peaks. She had saved her children from the town, but she suddenly realized she had delivered them straight into the cage of a mountain beast. And they were entirely alone. The night was an eternity of terror. Josie did not sleep. She corralled her 7 children onto the massive bearskin rug in front of the roaring hearth, wrapping them in every heavy wool blanket she could find. While they fell into the exhausted slumber of traumatized youth, Josie sat rigidly in a high-backed wooden chair facing the heavy oak door. Across her wide, plump lap rested a heavy iron fire poker. She spent the long, agonizing hours studying her new prison. The cabin was oddly contradictory for a mountain hermit. It was spotlessly clean. The pantry shelves were lined with neatly labeled mason jars of preserved peaches, salted venison, and dried beans. There was a large, hand-carved rocking chair in the corner that looked suspiciously like it was meant for a mother nursing a child. As the first gray light of dawn crept through the oiled paper windows, a heavy sound echoed from outside. Clack. The deadbolt slid back. The door swung inward, bringing with it a rush of freezing mountain air. Gideon stepped over the threshold, a freshly dressed brace of snowshoe hairs slung over his massive shoulder. Josie didn't hesitate. Using her substantial weight to her advantage, she surged upward from the chair with surprising speed. She swung the heavy iron poker like a baseball bat, aiming straight for the giant's ribs. Gideon didn't flinch. He simply dropped the hairs and caught the descending iron rod in his thick, leather-gloved hand. The impact sent a painful shudder up Josie's arm, but the mountain man stood like a granite statue. "You lock my children in a cage again, and I'll put this iron through your eye while you sleep," Josie snarled, her broad chest heaving, her eyes wild with maternal fury. Gideon gently but firmly twisted the poker out of her grasp and set it against the wall. "Sit down, Josephine." "I won't. I locked the door because of the grizzlies," Gideon interrupted, his deep voice calm and entirely devoid of malice. "They come down the ridge looking for food before the first snow. Last winter, a starving boar figured out how to lift the inner iron latch with his claws. The outer deadbolt is the only way to secure this cabin when I check the perimeter traps at night. I wasn't locking you in. I was locking the mountain out." Josie blinked, her anger deflating slightly as the logic settled in. She sank back heavily into the chair, the adrenaline draining from her stout frame. "Then why did you buy us, Mr. Hayes? I am a fat, penniless widow, with 7 mouths to feed. You live in a fortress at the edge of the world. None of this makes sense. Tell me the truth." Gideon walked over to a heavy wooden desk in the corner. He unlocked the top drawer and pulled out a worn leather satchel. He tossed it onto the table in front of Josie. "Your husband, Arthur, didn't die in a mining accident, Josie," Gideon said quietly. The air in the cabin seemed to vanish. Josie stared at the satchel. "What are you talking about? Mayor Higgins said the timber supports in the deep vein collapsed." "Arthur rode up this mountain 3 days before he died," Gideon explained, pulling a heavy, folded parchment from the satchel. He spread it out on the table. It was an official assayer's map, stamped with the seal of the Colorado Territorial Mining Commission. He found a blind vein, pure, uncut silver. It wasn't on the town's property. It was on his farmland. Your farmland. Josie's hands trembled as she touched the map. Arthur. Arthur never said a word. He was trying to register the claim secretly, but Clement Reed runs the bank, and he runs the assayer's office, Gideon said, his icy blue eyes narrowing with quiet rage. Reed found out. He caused that cave-in at the town mine to silence Arthur. Then he called in the fake debts to foreclose on your land, effectively stealing the silver claim. And to make sure no one ever questioned it, he was going to scatter your children to the wind and leave you to freeze in the alleys. Tears streamed down Josie's round cheeks. The sheer cruelty of it was staggering. Her husband had been murdered for the rocky dirt they lived on. I owed Arthur my life, Gideon continued softly. 5 years ago, during the Red River floods, I was pinned under a wagon. Arthur Dalton dragged me out of the mud. When I rode down to Oak Haven yesterday to trade, I asked for him. The livery boy told me he was dead, and that his family was being sold on the auction block. Josie wiped her face with the sleeve of her faded dress. So you bought us to settle a debt to a dead man? That was part of it, Gideon admitted, stepping closer to her. He looked down at her, his rugged face softening. But I also remembered you, Josephine. I saw you in town last spring. You were hauling a 50-pound sack of grain on your shoulder while Arthur was drinking at the saloon. You were laughing with your boys. I looked at you and I saw a woman who could survive the frontier, a woman built strong enough to weather the storms. Most men look at you and see weight. I looked at you and saw a fortress. Josie's breath hitched. In all her 32 years, no man had ever spoken of her size as a virtue. It had always been a source of ridicule, a burden. But this scarred, terrifying giant looked at her heavy frame as if it were carved from precious marble. I lost my wife and my little girl to the cholera outbreak of '67, Gideon whispered, the old pain flashing across his eyes. This cabin has been dead for 11 years. I didn't just bring you here to save you, Josie. I brought you here because I hoped, maybe, you could save me. The fragile piece of Bitter Peak lasted exactly 5 days. Josie and Gideon had fallen into a rhythm. She cooked massive, hearty meals, her heavy frame moving gracefully around the large kitchen, while the children took to the mountain like wild goats. Wyatt helped Gideon chop wood, and for the first time in weeks, Josie heard her children laugh. She found herself watching Gideon, admiring the strength in his broad shoulders and the surprising gentleness in his scarred hands when he helped little Pearl learn to walk. But on the morning of the 6th day, the valley below echoed with the sharp crack of a rifle. "Get away from the windows!" Gideon roared, kicking over the heavy oak dining table to create a barricade. Josie grabbed the younger children, her large body instinctively shielding them as she threw herself behind the overturned table. Wyatt scrambled to grab the Winchester rifle from above the mantel. Outside, a dozen men on horseback crested the ridge. Leading them was Jeremiah Tex Rollins, a notorious hired gun from Denver, and riding right beside him, looking pale and terrified in the mountain air, was Clement Reed. "Hayes!" Rollins shouted, his voice carrying over the wind. "We know the Dalton woman is in there. Reed here says you stole town property. Hand her and the brats over and we'll leave you to your mountain." "They want the map," Gideon said, checking the chambers of his twin Colt revolvers. Reed realized Arthur gave the claim survey to someone before he died. "He knows you have it." "They'll kill us all to cover it up," Josie realized, her heart pounding against her ribs. "Not today," Gideon growled. The gunfight erupted with terrifying violence. Bullets splintered the heavy oak door and shattered the windows. Gideon moved with lethal precision, firing through the gun ports he had carved into the logs years ago. 2 of Rollins' men fell from their saddles in the first volley, but there were 2 many of them. A heavy slug tore through the doorframe, catching Gideon in the left shoulder. He grunted, dropping one of his revolvers as he stumbled backward, blood blossoming across his heavy bear-hide coat. "Gideon!" Josie screamed. The front door buckled violently as two men slammed a heavy pine log against it from the porch. Crack! The hinges groaned. Josie didn't think. She acted. Leaving the children behind the table, she ran toward the door. As the outlaws rammed it a second time, bursting the iron deadbolt, the door flew open. A grinning outlaw stepped into the doorway, raising his pistol. He never got the chance to fire. Josie hit him with the force of a runaway freight train. Using all 250 pounds of her formidable weight, Josie slammed her broad shoulder into the man's chest. The impact lifted him off his feet, sending him flying backward off the porch to crash violently into the frozen dirt below. Before the second man could react, Josie grabbed the heavy iron fire poker she had used days earlier. With a deafening roar that echoed through the pines, she swung it in a massive arc, shattering the man's rifle and catching him squarely in the jaw. He went down in a heap. Wyatt stepped into the doorway beside his mother, the Winchester raised, and fired a warning shot that took the hat right off Clement Reed's head. "That's enough!" Gideon shouted, stepping up behind Josie, his good arm holding his remaining Colt steady, aimed directly at Rollins' chest. "The next man who steps on my porch dies. The woman stays, the children stay, and the silver claim is filed in Denver. I sent the papers with the stagecoach a week ago. You're too late, Reed." Reed's face drained of all color. The silver was gone. The secret was out. Rollins looked at the bleeding giant, the fiercely armed boy, and the massive, enraged mother wielding an iron bar like a warrior queen. He spat into the snow, turned his horse, and rode away. Reed, whimpering, scrambled to follow. Silence fell over Bitter Peak. Josie dropped the iron poker. Her thick chest heaved as she turned to Gideon. He was leaning heavily against the doorframe, clutching his bleeding shoulder. But he was looking at her with an expression of absolute awe. "You're hurt," Josie breathed, rushing to him. She wrapped her thick, warm arms around his waist to support his weight. "I've never seen anything more beautiful in my entire life," Gideon whispered, his icy blue eyes fixed entirely on her flushed, round face. Josie felt a hot tear slide down her cheek. For the first time in her life, she wasn't the town joke. She wasn't a burden. She was a mother who had defended her cubs, and a woman who had finally found a man strong enough to stand beside her. As the years passed, the Dalton silver mine made them wealthier than Clement Reed could have ever dreamed. But the true wealth remained high up on Bitter Peak. The fortress expanded, echoing with the laughter of 7 growing children, and eventually, a few more. Josephine Hayes became a legend in the Colorado Territory, a woman of grand stature and even grander spirit, who ruled the mountain alongside the giant who loved her exactly as she was. If you were captivated by Josephine's incredible journey from a desperate widow to the formidable matriarch of Bitter Peak, make sure to show your support. Like this video, share it with friends who love true frontier grit, and hit that subscribe button for more untold tales of the Wild West. Ring the notification bell so you never miss a story of courage, heartbreak, and triumph. What would you have done in Josie's shoes? Let us know in the comments below.